The December wind howled through the Rocky Mountain passes like a living thing, carrying with it the promise of death for any soul foolish enough to be caught in its path. Sarah Mitchell pulled her wool coat tighter around her shoulders, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air of the stagecoach. Through the frost-covered window, she could see nothing but a wall of white, snow falling so thick it seemed solid. "How much further to Cedar Ridge?" she called to the driver, her voice barely audible over the storm's rage. "Can't rightly say, miss," came the shouted reply from above. "This storm's got me turned around something fierce." Sarah's heart sank. She had already been traveling for 3 days from Denver, and her small savings were nearly depleted. The teaching position waiting for her in Cedar Ridge represented not just employment, but her chance to make a real difference in the world. At 24, she had left behind the comfortable but suffocating expectations of Boston society, determined to bring education to children who had never seen the inside of a proper schoolhouse. The stagecoach lurched violently to one side, throwing Sarah against the wooden wall. She heard the driver cursing above, followed by a sharp crack that could only mean one thing. They had broken an axle. "Miss Mitchell?" The driver's voice was tight with worry. "I'm afraid we're stuck fast. The front axles snapped clean through and this storm ain't letting up. We're maybe 2 miles from Jake Harrison's place. That's our only chance." Sarah climbed down from the disabled coach, her boots immediately sinking into snow that reached nearly to her knees. The wind cut through her clothing like knives of ice, and she could barely see 5 feet in any direction. The driver, a grizzled man named Pete, was already unhitching the horses. "I'll take one horse and try to reach Harrison's cabin," Pete shouted over the wind. "You stay with the coach, it'll give you some shelter." "No," Sarah grabbed his arm. "I'm coming with you. I won't survive the night alone out here." Pete looked at her city clothes and delicate frame with obvious doubt, but the desperation in her eyes convinced him. "All right, miss, but it's going to be rough going. Jake Harrison, he's not much for company. Been living alone up there for years. But he's a decent man, and he won't turn away folks in need." They set out on foot, leading one horse through the deepening snow. Sarah had never experienced cold like this. It seemed to penetrate her very bones, making each step an agony. Her fashionable Boston boots, so suitable for city sidewalks, were utterly inadequate for the mountain wilderness. Within minutes, her feet were numb, and ice was forming on her eyelashes. The wind seemed determined to push them back with every step. Sarah stumbled repeatedly, catching herself on Pete's strong arm or the horse's flank. Her lungs burned with each breath of the frigid air, and her legs grew heavier with each labored step through the snow. "There!" Pete pointed through the swirling white. "I can see smoke from his chimney." Sarah looked but could see nothing except the endless storm. She had to trust Pete's experienced eyes and his knowledge of these mountains. But with each passing minute, her strength was failing. The cold was winning, seeping into her core despite her best efforts to keep moving. Her steps became unsteady, then faltering. The world began to blur at the edges, and she realized with growing terror that she was losing the battle against the elements. Her body was shutting down, preparing for the eternal sleep that claimed so many in these unforgiving mountains. I can't," she whispered, her words lost in the wind. The last thing Sarah saw before darkness claimed her was Pete's worried face, and the faint outline of a cabin in the distance, smoke rising from its chimney like a beacon of hope in the wilderness. Underscore, 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 underscore. Living alone in the mountains for 5 years, the mountain man to read the signs. The way the wind changed direction, how the animals behaved, the particular quality of light that preceded a real mountain blizzard. He had prepared as he always did. Extra firewood stacked against the cabin, provisions secured, and his rifle cleaned and ready. At 32, Jake was a man shaped by solitude and hardship. His hands were calloused from years of chopping wood, hunting and maintaining his small homestead. His dark beard was neatly trimmed, and his blue eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to relying on himself alone. He had built this life deliberately, choosing isolation after losing everything that mattered to him in the disease-ravaged settlements below. He was mending a broken trap by the firelight when he heard Pete's desperate voice calling through the storm. Jake set down his tools and moved to the window, peering out into the white chaos. He could barely make out two figures in the snow, one supporting the other. Without hesitation, Jake pulled on his heavy coat and boots. He had no love for visitors. They brought complications, questions, and reminders of the world he had left behind. But mountain law was clear. You never turned away someone fighting the storm. He opened the door and stepped into the blizzard. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he was accustomed to these conditions. Through the swirling snow, he could see old Pete struggling to support a slight figure in dark clothing, a woman by the looks of it. "Pete," Jake called, his voice carrying despite the wind. "This way!" He reached them just as the woman collapsed completely, her legs giving out beneath her. Pete was trying to lift her, but the old man was clearly exhausted himself. "She's near froze through, Jake," Pete gasped. "Stagecoach broke down about 2 miles back. This here's Miss Sarah Mitchell. She's the new schoolteacher headed for Cedar Ridge." Jake looked down at the unconscious woman. Even in her current state, he could see she was young, probably mid-20s, with auburn hair escaping from beneath a wool cap. Her lips were blue with cold, and her breathing was shallow. She was clearly from back east. Her clothes, while practical enough for city life, were wholly inadequate for a Colorado mountain winter. Without a word, Jake scooped her up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel how cold she was even through her coat. Her head lolled against his shoulder as he carried her toward the cabin. "Bring the horse to the lean-to," he called back to Pete. "Then get inside before you freeze too." Inside the cabin, Jake's movements were swift and efficient. He laid Sarah on his own bed near the fireplace, then began the careful process of warming someone who was dangerously cold. He had seen hypothermia before. Warm her too quickly, and it could kill her just as surely as the cold. He removed her wet boots and stockings, noting with concern how white her toes were. Frostbite, but not too severe if treated properly. He wrapped her feet in dry wool blankets, then covered her with every quilt he owned. Pete stumbled through the door, stamping snow from his boots. "How is she?" "Cold. Bad cold, but she'll live if we're careful." Jake was already moving around the cabin, stoking the fire and putting water on to heat. "You know I don't take to visitors, Pete." "I know, Jake, and I'm sorry. But what choice did we have? The storm won't break for days, and she'd have died for certain if we'd stayed with the coach." Jake said nothing, focusing on his tasks. He prepared warm broth and gathered dry clothes. His own shirts and pants, far too large for her but warm and dry. When someone was fighting hypothermia, modesty was a luxury that could prove fatal. As the cabin warmed and Sarah's color began to improve slightly, Jake found himself studying her face. There was something determined about her features, even in unconsciousness, a set to her jaw that spoke of inner strength. Her hands, though soft and clearly unused to manual labor, showed ink stains that marked her as someone who spent time writing. A schoolteacher. Jake felt an unexpected twist in his chest. He had once believed in the power of education, had even dreamed of ensuring his own children would have opportunities he had never known. But that was before fever took his wife and infant son, before he learned that all the book learning in the world couldn't protect the people you loved. Sarah stirred slightly, murmuring something unintelligible. Her eyelashes fluttered, and Jake found himself hoping she would wake soon. The longer someone stayed unconscious from the cold, the worse their chances became. "She's a fighter," Pete observed, settling into the chair near the fire. "Walked near 2 miles in that storm before she gave out. Most city folks would have collapsed in the first 100 yards. Jake nodded, surprising himself by feeling a grudging respect for the unconscious woman. Anyone foolish enough to travel to the frontier alone in winter was either very brave or very desperate. Looking at her face, peaceful now in the firelight, he suspected it might be both. Chapter 3. Awakening to a New World. Sarah's consciousness returned slowly, like emerging from a deep, cold pool. The first thing she noticed was warmth, blessed, life-giving warmth that seemed to envelop her entire body. The second was the unfamiliar scent of pine wood and something else. Coffee, perhaps, and the lingering aroma of cooked meat. Her eyes fluttered open to find herself staring at a rough-hewn wooden ceiling. This wasn't the stagecoach, and it certainly wasn't any hotel she had ever seen. The walls around her were made of thick logs chinked with mud and moss, and a fire crackled cheerfully in a stone fireplace nearby. Animal pelts hung on the walls, wolf, deer, and what looked like a massive bear hide. She tried to sit up and immediately felt dizzy. Her body felt strange, weak but warm, and she realized with growing alarm that she was wearing clothes that were far too large for her, a man's flannel shirt and wool pants that had been rolled up at the cuffs. "Easy there, miss." The voice was deep and unfamiliar. "You've been out for near 12 hours. Sarah turned her head to see a man sitting at a rough wooden table, watching her with steady blue eyes. He was tall, even sitting down, with broad shoulders and capable hands wrapped around a steaming cup. His dark hair was thick and slightly unkempt, and his beard was neat but full. Everything about him spoke of life lived outdoors, of self-reliance and quiet strength. Where am I?" Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat dry and scratchy. "My cabin. Name's Jake Harrison. You collapsed in the storm last night. Pete and I brought you here." He stood and moved to the fire, ladling something from a pot hanging over the flames. "You need to drink this. Broth will help get your strength back." Sarah struggled to sit up properly, pulling the heavy quilts around her shoulders. The cabin was small but well organized. Everything had its place. Tools hanging on wooden pegs, shelves lined with preserved foods, books stacked neatly in one corner. It was the home of someone who had learned to live with only what was essential. "Pete, is he?" "He's fine. Rode out this morning when the storm broke to get help with the stagecoach. Should be back by evening with some men from town." Jake approached the bed, carrying a wooden bowl filled with aromatic broth. "Can you hold this, or do you need help?" Sarah reached for the bowl, surprised by how her hand shook. The simple act of lifting it to her lips required more effort than she expected. The broth was rich and warming, with herbs she didn't recognize, but that seemed to spread strength through her body with each sip. "Thank you," she said after a few spoonfuls. I remember the cold and walking, but then everything went dark. You saved my life." Jake returned to his chair, his expression unreadable. "Mountain law. You don't leave folks to freeze, no matter who they are or where they come from." There was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't entirely pleased with the situation. Sarah studied his face, noting the way he avoided direct eye contact and kept his distance from the bed. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she offered. "I was traveling to Cedar Ridge to take a teaching position there." "So Pete said." Jake's response was curt, almost dismissive. Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment. It was clear she was an unwelcome burden, and the realization stung more than she expected. "I understand you're not accustomed to visitors. As soon as Pete returns and we can arrange transportation, I'll be out of your way." Jake glanced at her then, and she caught something that might have been surprise in his expression. "Didn't mean to sound unfriendly, it's just, I chose this life for reasons, don't get many visitors, and that's how I prefer it." "What reasons?" The question slipped out before Sarah could stop herself, and she immediately regretted her boldness. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "Lost my family 5 years ago. Fever took them both, my wife Mary and our baby son. After that, I couldn't. Cities, towns, they all felt like places where people go to die. Up here, a man can live or die on his own terms." The pain in his voice was raw, despite the years that had passed. Sarah felt her heart contract with sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "Don't need sympathy," Jake replied, but his tone had softened slightly. "What about you? Boston lady comes west to teach school. That's either running toward something or away from it." Sarah considered his words, surprised by his insight. "A bit of both, I suppose. I was engaged to a man my father chose. Wealthy, proper, everything a Boston lady should want. But I wanted something more than drawing-room conversations and charity committees. I wanted to make a real difference in the world." "So you came to Cedar Ridge. Population maybe 60 on a good day, and half of those are minors who can't read their own names." "Exactly." Sarah's voice grew stronger, animated by her conviction. "Those children deserve the same opportunities as any child in Boston. They deserve to dream beyond these mountains if they choose to." Jake studied her with new interest. "And you think book learning's going to give them that?" "I think knowledge is the only thing that can't be taken away from you," Sarah replied firmly. "A person might lose their home, their money, their health, but what they know, what they understand about the world, that stays with them forever." Something shifted in Jake's expression. He stood abruptly and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. Pretty words. But knowledge didn't save my wife when the fever came. All her reading, all her education, none of it mattered when she needed it most. Sarah set down her bowl, understanding beginning to dawn. She was educated, school teacher, just like you, came west to bring civilization to the frontier. Jake's voice was bitter now. Difference was she married me first, thought love and learning could make a life in these mountains. The silence stretched between them, heavy with old grief and unspoken regret. Sarah realized she was not just an inconvenient stranger to this man, she was a painful reminder of everything he had lost and deliberately left behind. Underscore, 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 underscore. Chapter 4. Bridging Two Worlds. The afternoon light. Sarah had spent the day resting and observing Jake's solitary routine when Pete returned. The way he moved efficiently through his daily tasks, spoke sparingly, and seemed most comfortable when focused on practical matters like maintaining his tools or checking his supplies. She had tried several times to engage him in conversation, but each attempt met with polite but distant responses. Only when she asked about survival in the mountains did his manner warm slightly, and he had shown her how to properly layer clothing for warmth and explained which plants could be used for medicine. "Miss Mitchell?" Pete's weathered face broke into a relieved grin as he stamped snow from his boots. "Good to see you up and about. This here's Tom Bradley, runs the general store in Cedar Ridge, and his sons Mark and David." Tom Bradley was a sturdy man in his 40s with kind eyes and a practical manner. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Mitchell, though I wish it were under better circumstances. The whole town's been worried since word came about the stagecoach." "We've got the coach fixed and loaded on a sledge," added Mark, a young man who couldn't have been much older than Sarah herself. "Should have you to town well before dark, assuming the weather holds." Jake had remained silent during the introductions, but Sarah noticed how he positioned himself near the door, clearly eager for his unwanted guests to depart. The realization that she would likely never see him again after today struck her with unexpected force. "Mr. Harrison," she said, standing carefully. Her strength had returned considerably, though she still felt shaky. "I can never adequately thank you for what you've done. You saved my life." Jake nodded curtly. "No thanks needed. Glad you're feeling better." Tom Bradley stepped forward, his expression earnest. "Jake, you know the whole town owes you a debt for this. If there's anything we can do—" "Nothing needed," Jake replied, already moving to help gather Sarah's belongings, her coat now dry, her damaged boots, and the small satchel that contained her teaching materials. As the men prepared for departure, Sarah found herself reluctant to leave. There was something about this place, about Jake himself, that called to a part of her she hadn't known existed. Despite his gruff manner, she had seen glimpses of the man beneath, his careful attention to her condition, the way he had explained mountain survival with quiet patience, the books on his shelves that spoke of an educated mind. "Mr. Harrison," she said quietly, as the others loaded supplies onto the sledge outside. "Your wife. What was her name?" Jake paused in his movements, his hands stilling on her coat. "Mary. Mary Elizabeth Garrett before we married. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was." Jake's voice was soft. "Believed she could change the world, one student at a time. Had more courage than sense coming out here to marry a mountain man she'd only known through letters." "Letters?" Jake looked embarrassed. "My brother lived in Denver, worked for the territorial government. He knew Mary's family. Told her about me after he died in an avalanche. She wrote to me and I wrote back. For 2 years we corresponded before she agreed to come west and marry me." Sarah felt a strange flutter in her chest at this revelation. "She fell in love with your mind before she ever saw your face." "Maybe so." Jake handed her the coat, their fingers brushing briefly. But love wasn't enough to keep her alive when it mattered. "Ready, Miss Mitchell?" Tom called from the doorway. Sarah nodded but lingered a moment longer. "Mr. Harrison, would it be all right if I wrote to you? About the school? About how the children are progressing? I think Mary would have wanted someone to continue her dream." Jake's blue eyes searched her face for a long moment. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I suppose that would be acceptable." The sledge ride to Cedar Ridge took 3 hours through snow-covered valleys and pine forests that sparkled in the late afternoon sun. Sarah found herself looking back repeatedly at Jake's cabin until it disappeared from view. Wondering why leaving felt like losing something precious she had only just discovered. Cedar Ridge proved to be smaller than she had imagined, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street with the mountains rising dramatically on all sides. The school was a simple one-room building, with benches for desks and a pot-bellied stove for heat. It was nothing like the well-appointed academy where she had taught in Boston, but as she stood in the doorway looking at the empty room, Sarah felt a surge of excitement. 17 children when they all attend, Tom Bradley explained. Ages 6 to 15. Some of them have never been inside a schoolhouse before. That evening, staying in the Bradleys' spare room above the general store, Sarah sat at a small desk and began her first letter to Jake Harrison. She wrote about her first impressions of the town, her plans for the school, and her gratitude for his kindness. But mostly she found herself writing about Mary, asking about her teaching methods, her favorite subjects, her dreams for education on the frontier. As she sealed the letter, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed during her brief stay in Jake's cabin. The mountains had claimed a part of her heart, and the lonely man who lived among them had awakened something in her soul that she hadn't known was sleeping. Outside her window, the peaks glowed silver in the moonlight, and somewhere among them a man sat alone by his fire, perhaps remembering a time when his cabin had echoed with a woman's laughter and dreams of a better tomorrow. Chapter 5. The Heart's True Compass. 3 months had passed since that winter storm changed 2 lives forever. Sarah's letters to Jake had become a weekly ritual, and to her surprise, he had begun writing back. What started as brief practical responses had gradually evolved into longer exchanges about books, about life in the mountains, and about the children Sarah was teaching. The school in Cedar Ridge was thriving beyond her wildest expectations. 17 children attended regularly, their eager faces reminding her daily why she had left Boston. There was 8-year-old Emma, whose quick mind devoured every book Sarah could provide, and teenage Marcus, who had never learned to read but was making remarkable progress. The older boys, initially skeptical of a fancy Eastern lady, had come to respect her after she successfully treated young Billy Patterson's broken arm, using wilderness medicine Jake had taught her during her brief stay at his cabin. But it was the letters that truly sustained her through the long winter months. Jake wrote about the wildlife he observed, the subtle changes in weather patterns, the books he read by firelight. His writing revealed the educated, thoughtful man beneath the rugged exterior, a man who quoted Shakespeare and Thoreau as easily as he discussed tracking elk or preserving meat for winter. The children would love to hear about the eagle family that nested near your cabin, Sarah had written in her latest letter. Emma asked if eagles truly mate for life, as you mentioned. She's quite the romantic for an 8-year-old. Jake's response had arrived faster than usual. Tell Emma that eagles do indeed choose one partner for life. They build their nest together, hunt together, raise their young together. When one dies, the other sometimes never takes another mate. Perhaps there's wisdom in that kind of devotion, even if it means facing the rest of life alone. The words had haunted Sarah for days. She sensed Jake was writing about more than eagles. Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow and opening the mountain passes. With it came an unexpected visitor to Cedar Ridge, Dr. William Hartwell, Sarah's former fiancé from Boston. He arrived on the morning stagecoach, impeccably dressed despite the long journey, his blonde hair perfectly groomed and his manner as confident as ever. "Sarah, my dear," William said, approaching her as she dismissed her students for the day, "I've come to take you home." Sarah stared at him in shock. William looked completely out of place against the backdrop of rough wooden buildings and snow-capped peaks, like an expensive painting hung in a mining camp. "William, what are you doing here? Rescuing you from this adventure." His tone was condescending, the same tone that had driven her to break their engagement months ago. "Your father sent me. He's arranged everything. We can be married as soon as we return to Boston. This teaching experiment has gone on long enough." "This isn't an experiment, William. This is my life." William's expression grew stern. "Sarah, be reasonable. Look around you. This is no place for a woman of your breeding. You're wasting your talents on children who will never amount to anything more than miners and farmers." The casual dismissal of her students and their potential ignited Sarah's temper. "These children are bright, capable and deserving of every opportunity. They're not wasting my talents, they're fulfilling them. And what about us? What about the life we planned together?" "The life you planned," Sarah corrected. "I never wanted that life, William. I tried to tell you, but you never listened." Their argument was interrupted by Tom Bradley approaching from the general store. "Miss Mitchell, there's someone here to see you." Sarah looked past Tom and felt her heart skip. Jake Harrison stood near the hitching post, looking uncomfortable in his clean clothes and obviously ill at ease in town. He held an envelope in his weathered hands. "Jake," Sarah breathed, unconsciously using his first name. "What are you doing here?" Jake's blue eyes flicked to William, taking in the expensive clothes and citified appearance. Something shifted in his expression, a closing off, a withdrawal that Sarah had seen before. "Got your last letter," Jake said quietly, extending the envelope toward her. "Wanted to return this in person." Sarah opened the envelope and found her own letter inside, the one where she had poured out her growing feelings, where she had finally admitted that she thought about him every day, that she had found herself falling in love with the man revealed in his careful, thoughtful words. "Jake, seems you've got other concerns now," Jake said, his voice carefully neutral as he nodded toward William. "City gentlemen come to call. Probably best all around." William stepped forward, his manner possessive. "I'm Dr. William Hartwell, Sarah's fiancé, and you are?" "Jake Harrison." Jake's response was curt. "I was just leaving. Jake, please." Sarah reached for his arm, but he stepped back. "This isn't what it looks like." "Looks like you've got your life sorted out, Miss Mitchell. That's good. That's what you deserve." Jake touched the brim of his hat. "Take care of yourself." He turned and walked toward his horse, every line of his body rigid with controlled emotion. Sarah watched him go, feeling as though something precious was slipping through her fingers. "Sarah," William said, his voice smug with satisfaction, "shall we make arrangements for our departure?" Sarah looked at William, handsome, successful, offering her everything Boston society valued. Then she looked at Jake's retreating figure, seeing the man who had saved her life, who had shared his deepest thoughts through careful letters, who had awakened her heart to possibilities she had never imagined. "No, William." Sarah's voice was quiet, but firm. "I'm not going back to Boston. Don't be ridiculous." "I said no." Sarah lifted her chin, feeling strength flow through her like the mountain streams that ran wild and free outside town. "I'm not your fiancé, William. I haven't been since the day I left Boston, and I'm exactly where I belong." Without waiting for his response, Sarah gathered her skirts and ran after Jake. She caught up with him just as he was mounting his horse. "Jake, wait!" He paused, but didn't look at her. "Nothing to wait for, Sarah. You've got your gentleman caller, your chance to go back to the life you really want." "That's not the life I want." Sarah's voice rang out across the street, causing several townspeople to look their way. She didn't care. "The life I want is here in these mountains with these children, right with you." Jake finally turned to face her, and she saw the pain in his blue eyes. "You don't know what you're saying. I'm not a city man, Sarah. I can't give you fine things, fancy parties, or the kind of life you're used to. I don't want those things." Sarah stepped closer, her heart pounding. "I want late-night conversations by the fire. I want someone who sees the world the way you do, who values learning and truth and the kind of quiet strength that comes from living honestly. I want the man who writes about eagles mating for life." Jake's composure cracked slightly. "Sarah, I love you, Jake Harrison. Not because you rescued me from the storm, but because of who you are, because of the way you think, the way you see the world, the way you've learned to find meaning in solitude without becoming bitter." Jake dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "You sure about this? Mountain life is hard, lonely sometimes, and I might not be ready to love again, might never be ready." Sarah smiled, feeling tears on her cheeks. "I'm not asking you to love me today. I'm asking you to let me try to earn that love, to let me prove that some city ladies are made of stronger stuff than you might think." Jake reached up and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Mary used to say that the heart has its own compass, and it always points toward home. And where does your compass point, Jake?" Jake looked at her for a long moment, then glanced around at the town, the mountains, the life she had chosen. Slowly, a smile spread across his weathered features, the first real smile Sarah had ever seen from him. "Home," he said simply. "It points toward home." As Jake's arms closed around her, Sarah heard William's voice calling her name from behind, but it seemed to come from very far away. The only thing that mattered was the steady beat of Jake's heart against her cheek, and the promise of a future written not in Boston drawing rooms, but in mountain cabins where eagles soared overhead, and two hearts could learn to trust in love again. The mountains watched over them with ancient patience, keeping their secrets and blessing their choice, as they had blessed countless other souls brave enough to follow their hearts into the wilderness and discover that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the truest destinations.